Welcome to the ASEAN Wonk Podcast, where we bring you expert insights on regional perspectives on Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific geopolitics and geoeconomics. I'm your host, Dr. Prashant Paramaswaran, and if you don't already, do subscribe to the ASEAN Wonk platform at www.aseanwonk.com so you don't miss all our posts. Our guest today is Dato Ilango Karuppannan, who has over 30 years of experience as a distinguished Malaysian diplomat with posts that included High Commissioner in Singapore, Acting Ambassador in the United States, as well as Ambassador in Lebanon, where Malaysia still maintains a role in the UN peacekeeping force amid escalating tensions in the Middle East. We start our conversation talking about the role of Malaysia's Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, in positioning the country geopolitically and geoeconomically amid U.S.-China competition and the Gaza war. Make sure you watch, listen, and read the full episode as we go through a range of other subjects, including Malaysia's approach to flashpoints like the South China Sea and its coming agenda for the ASEAN chairmanship in 2025. So welcome to the ASEAN Wonk Podcast. Ilango, thank you for joining us, and let's get started with our conversation. I think a lot of ink has been spilled on Anwar's rhetoric and Malaysia's recent foreign policy moves, its rhetoric on the Israel-Gaza war, and its interest in the BRICS. We were talking a little bit about this right before recording. Much of this is not really new, and it's a product of strands in Malaysian foreign policy. We saw coexistence, for example, during Mahathir's time between Malaysia's non-aligned rhetoric, but actually relations with the United States in some areas like security were actually moving under the radar as well. So I guess the more interesting question to my mind is, beyond Malaysia doing X or doing Y to benefit, power A or power B, 2 years into Anwar's term, how do we really assess the Anwar government's ability to secure Malaysia's own interests in a more competitive and contested world? So we can go with individual metrics like, how many trips has Anwar taken, which is quite a few. He's been very active after Malaysia's kind of revolving door of prime ministers. We can look at foreign investment. There have been a number of tech investments that have been quite notable. But if we could just zoom out a little bit from these individual metrics and just ask the question, how would you assess Anwar's foreign policy so far? And you could use kind of a scale of 1 to 10 or a letter grade, but you're somebody who's been involved in Malaysia's diplomacy for decades, so you've seen this firsthand. How do we go about assessing Anwar's performance on Malaysia's foreign policy?
Okay, thank you, Prashant, for that question. Well, you're right. I've been a diplomat for over 33 years, but I also currently teaching a master's course at the University of Malaya. So I think I shall use the grading system that they use at university to grade Dato Anwar's performance, right? Well, in the University of Malaya, they use 7 out of 10 or 70% as a passing mark for masters. Okay? So I will have to start by giving Dato Anwar a passing mark, 7 out of 10. Okay? But 7 out of 10 is nothing to be really jumping about because you just basically crossed the bar, You don't have to repeat the course. Now, let me tell you why I think he deserves a 7 upon 10. First, I think the effort. I think he has put in quite a bit of effort. Malaysia's foreign policy, has been there's been a display of active diplomacy under his premiership. You must also know that Dato Anwar is actually now the longest-serving prime minister in the last, 6 years or so. It's very strange to hear that, but he is actually the longest-serving prime minister, and therefore that has given him the chance to be a bit more active on the foreign policy side, right? We have seen Anwar actively engaging with, by visiting practically all the ASEAN countries. He's done that in the first year. That's a good thing. He's visited China a few times. He has been active on the Middle East issue. He has spoken about some of the global South issues as well. So I think on the part of active diplomacy, I think he deserves quite good marks. So that's one. Number two, I think there is a problem because it seems to be a little bit unbalanced. All these efforts that put in so far. There seems to be, of course, a lot more emphasis on China, which is, of course, not, we can understand it because China is a very close neighbor, a huge trading partner, and so on and so forth. Plus, it's easier to travel to China than to travel to America, for example. There's a lot more ground to cover, a lot more issues, no preparation. So he hasn't been very much he's not been to the United States except for the UNGA session, and I think for the summit that was held in America under Biden last 2 years ago. So I think that's a little bit unbalanced on that part. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on the Muslim world, so that also adds to that notion that there is a bit of imbalance here. Thirdly, I think insofar as strategic gains are concerned, one would be hard-pressed to find whether there's been significant strategic gains. For example, we are still not out of the woods insofar as it's concerned. With all the effort that has been China, one would have expected a bit more smooth sailing with China, but unfortunately, we are still not there. The Chinese side still holds on to the same position. You are aware that they have issued protest notes against Petronas's exploration for gas and oil over the Lupunia shoals, and so forth. So there is the impression that there is not so much strategic gains that we would have expected. So on these three grounds, I think I would give him a pass mark, a 7 out of 10, Prashant.
Great, thanks. A lot there that you mentioned, and I like how you distinguish between, there's a lot of activity, and so, Prime Minister Anwar deserves some credit for that. But the big issue, as you pointed out, is the extent to which this is producing strategic benefits for Malaysia, and to what extent this is producing those benefits across the various relationships that Malaysia has. And that's, China, the United States, but also, as you mentioned, the global south, the developing world, a lot of these major strands in Malaysian foreign policy that's very complex. I guess one more specific aspect of that is, sort of what you've mentioned already, which is this environment of U.S.-China competition, or I guess different people characterize it in different ways. I think part of it is U.S.-China competition being much more intensified, but frankly, it's also a much more complex and fractured global order, right? So we're talking about more protectionist sentiment, a lot more pressure on multilateral organizations, including ASEAN and the United Nations. So I guess in this competitive environment, I guess there's sometimes a tendency to try to place Southeast Asian countries on, if there's a U.S.-China spectrum, where do you fall? Do you fall on this side or that side? I'm less interested in that and more interested actually in a conversation about how Malaysia is navigating this environment relative to its other Southeast Asian neighbors, right? And you kind of hinted at this earlier. So, for example, when we're thinking about the relationship with the United States, both Indonesia and Vietnam have been able to get upgrades with the United States and engage with a mix of diverse partners on ecosystems, on emerging technologies. Malaysia has been able to get some of those technology-related investments from companies, including U.S. companies, but the high-level engagement with the United States, partly because of the Gaza issue, hasn't been in place, right? So some might say, this is, in terms of strategic positioning, Malaysia is losing out. Others might say, well, frankly, who cares, right? So as long as Malaysia is getting in some of this tech investments, maybe there might be a new administration after, elections and more recalibration in the United States. And then Malaysia can kind of reposition itself. But I guess the big question for me in all of this is, Malaysia's own strategic value, right? And you pointed at this earlier, which is If you're a naval planner, it's hard to miss that Malaysia is not strategically positioned next to the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. If you are a strategist sitting in Beijing, you would kind of see Malaysia as being a vital part of your strategy in Southeast Asia, because maritime Southeast Asia is not very hospitable historically towards China, right? So if China were to be able to get a toehold in Malaysia, in maritime Southeast Asia, that would affect general kind of strategic planning in the competitive landscape, right? And the other aspect that you would look for in China is, you sort of talked about Malaysia's engagements with China. If you're planning any kind of infrastructure or connectivity with railroads, Malaysia is a place where you get connectivity from Thailand and Malaysia, which connects mainland Southeast Asia with maritime Southeast Asia. So for me, my big question, I guess, is how do we kind of define Malaysia's strategic value in this US-China competition, right? Because sometimes I feel like the headlines, there's a lot of focus on Malaysia as kind of the semiconductor hub, and there's one or two pieces of this. But given your diplomatic experience and expertise, including having served in the United States, I mean, how would you see, sort of defining Malaysia's strategic value? And then how do we understand how Malaysia is leveraging that strategic value in this US-China competition for its own interests?
Okay. Yeah, that's a very long question, but so how do we leverage our strategic, what is our strategic outlook here and how are we leveraging all of them, right? Number one. Well, honestly, I'm looking at it from a diplomatic perspective. I understand that the noises coming out from the media world is somewhat, I suppose, is a bit distorted because they have a certain audience that they want to project their views to, right? So I think there's a little bit more of trying to oversell things rather than, or rather put it up in a more sensationalist perspective. But I really haven't seen a great big shift in terms of our strategic outlook, say from the times of Dr. Mahathir's time all the way now. Generally, we look at it this way. I mean, we, I think, very strongly wedded to the idea that we cannot take sides, that's for sure. We understand the value of having excellent relationship with the United States. It's true, it's a bit unfortunate that I suppose timing is also part of the problem, that we have not been able to engage as much as we should have with the United States right now. I've been talking to some of my American colleagues here. I think there's been a missed chance for a telephone conversation early in the days of when Anwar became Prime Minister that would have sort of settled down all this niggling questions here, whether we are thinking differently about America or not. So that's not true. We are still in the same way with America. And I want to add that there is also a strategic dialogue at the senior officials level with Malaysia, between Malaysia and the United States. Because of COVID, it had been put on hold for a number of years. It is restarting. My understanding is that it is taking place very soon, probably next week or so. So that's actually a very strong indicator that we value the relationship and we intend to, prep it up. So this is the way Malaysia has always been dealing with the United States. While it's very difficult for us to have very high-level engagement with the U.S. because of many structural constraints, timing-wise and, logistics, etc., but we try to bolster this with high quality or good quality relationship at the officials level. With the Defense Ministry, I think there's a good relationship going on. I just read in the news the other day that the U.S. has handed over a coastal cutter to Malaysia, to patrol its waters. And the reason why Malaysia has taken it up is, I think, quite clear too, because we do not intend to allow China to push us off our, the rights of patrolling our territory, EEZ, for example. So I think, in the past, we have been a bit lucky because there's been this competition between the US and China has been rather benign, so it did not put us into the spotlight. The current problem really is not us. I think the problem is actually because of the intensification of this rivalry between the United States and China, which has unfortunately, the spotlight is also shining on us now. The question is, how are we dealing with it? The problem is we are dealing with it exactly as we've been dealing with it for the last 20, 30 years. Question is that the spotlight is now shining on us and we are trying to explain it. So with China, our relationship has also been the same, but it has become substantially difficult because the Chinese are also now very much aware that they also have to put up a strong man show out there to show that they are not seen as soft or being pushed over or being overly aligned with Malaysia. That's also not to their interest. So there is a whole lot of things going on. Nobody wants to be seen as being aligned anywhere. At the same time, you need to balance the thing by showing that I'm still, not giving up my right to any of these claims or any of these things. So to cut a very long rambling answer of mine, I think the relationship that Malaysia, the way the Malaysia looks at it has not changed, number one. We are still keeping up the same methodology that we have always used. That is while in between high-level contact between the ministers and the Prime Minister, the leaders, we try to have good quality senior officials level communication going on. And I have not seen any evidence, not a single evidence that has gone wrong. That is still going on very well. In terms of investments, as far as you said, I think the numbers show that the U.S. is probably now leading as the long-term overall investor in this part of the world, and that also seems to be, it's not changing. When I talk to the Chambers of Commerce people, there's still this strong interest going on. Furthermore, with this interest of diversifying or moving away the semiconductors industries now back to this part of the world, Penang, for example, has become a sought-after destination. So from the strategic outlook, from the economic side, from the investments, they all are good. I think where there is a serious problem is because there is also a huge problem going on in the Middle East. And Malaysia, unfortunately, because of the very strong position that we have taken on the Middle East for the longest time, we just cannot remain silent. So Anwar is compelled to speak about it. Maybe he's spoken about it a bit more than others would have done so. So that also adds to the optics that perhaps Malaysia is not. Has a certain different view with the American on the American side. But I would want to assure your listeners that, from my perspective, looking at it objectively as a diplomat, I do not see a great big divergence yet.
I think that's very helpful because I think given your experience, you framed it as a very multi-level reality, right? So even though, as you say, I think at least the U.S. diplomats that I talked to would agree that there were, I think, initial lost opportunities to engage the Anwar government early on. And then obviously the crisis took place in the Middle East last year in October. And obviously that lost opportunity then, made things a little bit more challenging on that front. I think you also noted very clearly there that I think there's a recognition on both sides, it's fair to say. I think you talked to diplomats on the Malaysian side, officials there as well, and on the U.S. side, that there are a lot of things going on in the relationship. Maybe they're going on quietly, but it doesn't mean that if there aren't these sort of high-level upgrades that there isn't anything going on. You mentioned maritime security, which is extremely critical, still going on. There was a exercise Karis strike that the U.S. conducted with Malaysia and Australia that took place a few months ago as well. So, there are a lot of things that are happening irrespective. And as you pointed out as well, U.S. engagement is more than just this high-level or leader-level engagement. U.S. companies engage extensively in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia as well. So there's that dynamic as well to recognize. I also think it's hard to quantify, but I think there have been a couple of public instances where actually the Anwar government has sort of had to tamp down some of the Israel-Gaza sentiment. For example, there was a defense exhibition, and there was some Malaysian sort of I guess pushback or backlash against the involvement of U.S. and U.S.-linked companies and Israeli-linked equipment and so on and so forth. And the Anwar government, came out quite clearly and said, hey, we've got to, yes, we understand that there's Middle East sentiment issues here, but we also have very clear economic equities, right, and defense equities in this relationship. And so I think you can't just focus on some aspects of the government where they're playing it up and then not focus on the aspects where they're tamping it down. It's also a bit of a balancing act domestically for Malaysia. But I think sometimes that's missed in the headlines as well. Because like you said, it's the audience and, what people choose to emphasize. I wonder if we could move on to talk a little bit about Malaysia's upcoming ASEAN chairmanship in 2025.
Okay.
And here we're very fortunate to have you, because you can talk about this from a very historical perspective, because back when Malaysia was doing its chairmanship back in 2005, you were involved actually in some of the major deliverables and developments that happened during that chairmanship. One was the East Asia Summit, which was a very important sort of mechanism through which ASEAN engages major powers, which has given rise to some of the things we hear every year about whether the U.S. president is attending this meeting or not. But also the ASEAN Charter, which is an extremely important mechanism. Malaysia played a role, and obviously it happened later, helping institutionalize some of the ASEAN mechanisms. So I wanted to ask, I wanted to get your perspective in particular, because you were actually involved in this period. I think one view might be that was sort of almost the heyday of ASEAN, the sort of 2000s where ASEAN was really active. There was this institutionalization agenda. It was actually ahead, you could argue, of this Indo-Pacific game, because the East Asia Summit was about engaging not just the ASEAN +3, but also, India, the US, so on and so forth. But then I guess even multilateralists today, like Indonesia's former foreign minister, Martina Tulagawa, have argued that since then, it's become more challenging for ASEAN in the 2010s and the 2020s in this environment of intensifying US-China competition. That, I still remember Pak Marty was proposing this idea of an Indo-Pacific treaty in the 2010s. And it didn't really go anywhere, unfortunately. And now ASEAN was then behind the curve. And after all these Indo-Pacific strategies, it had to come up with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, for example. So I guess help us set the context for Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship. We're talking about this ASEAN Vision 2045 and so on and so forth. But from your perspective of somebody who's worked on these issues, where is ASEAN today, and what is the ASEAN that Malaysia is inheriting with respect to the ASEAN chairmanship?
Thank you for what I can talk all day long about ASEAN, because as you mentioned, I've been involved in this so deeply. But when we were chair in 2005, yeah, you're right. But you made also a very good observation.